Following the discussion at the end of Chapter 2, Mill follows up with a question that is quite appropriate. Remember that the end of Chapter 2 highlighted objections, which said that Mill's theory is too demanding in terms of its demand for absolute impartiality in particular. And because of this, he begins Chapter 3 by asking, what is the sanction of the principle of morality? What is the sanction of the principle of morality? That is, what are the motives to obey? What is the source of its obligation? Whence does it derive its binding force? Now, utilitarians tend to adhere to the psychological theory known as psychological egoism. Psychological egoism can be characterized in various ways, but we might summarize it simply by saying it's the view that says that human beings are always and only motivated by self-interest. Traditionally, this theory has been taken almost as an axiom in economics and related fields, even as definitional of rationality itself. So that's psychological egoism. And obviously, this psychological theory doesn't fit well with utilitarianism. And this leads Mill to have to explain how a human being who is naturally motivated only by his own pleasure can be motivated to pursue selfless, altruistic behavior. Mill admits that it is, this is in his own words, quote, "it is a necessary part of moral philosophy to provide the answer to this question," unquote. However, he makes it clear that he doesn't regard this as a special problem for utilitarianism in particular. This is the problem, he thinks, for every type of moral theory, at least one that asks the reader to adopt a non-customary standard of morality. The problem, Mill thinks, is inherent in the nature of his project. In the second paragraph of Chapter 3, he writes, this is at the end of the paragraph, last few lines. "The difficulty has no peculiar application to the doctrine of utility, but is inherent in every attempt to analyze morality and reduce it to principles, which, unless the principle is already in men's minds, invested with as much sacredness as any of its applications, always seems to divest them of a part of their sanctity." The principles, that is. So if ethical theory is concerned with discovering or elucidating or stating in a more exact way the fundamental principle of morality, as Mill thinks it is, then this is going to face the problem of being relatively new and unfamiliar. If it weren't new and unfamiliar to people, there'd be no reason for the philosopher to spend all this time developing the theory. And so the problem is going to be that it's not going to have the kind of weight or sanction of tradition. It's not going to have that kind of aura of sacredness around it that venerable old principles do. So that's the problem he's referring to here. So the question arises, why am I bound to promote the general happiness? Mill asks precisely this question at the end of the first paragraph of Chapter 3. Why am I bound to promote the general happiness? If my own happiness lies in something else, why may I not give that the preference? So that's the question that arises when this principle is proposed. Now, Mill implies that this principle, or I should say raising a question about this principle, raising this kind of question, why should I promote the general happiness, this can arise only due to a deficiency in our education. As of yet, he says, the feeling of unity with our fellow creatures, the feeling of unity with our fellow creatures has not taken a sufficiently deep root in our character. Mill is thus providing in this chapter what might be called a theory of moral motivation. This is a psychological theory that is conceived both as a means of understanding why people are in fact moral as well as an aid to promoting a moral education that will make them moral. So this is what I'm calling a theory of moral motivation, although Mill doesn't quite come out and say this is what he's doing. It's pretty fair to assume that it is what he is doing. A psychological theory that's going to help us understand why people are in fact moral, and also, through this understanding, provide an aid to promoting moral education that will make people more moral than they are. It's important to see that as Mill conceives the work that he's doing in Chapter 3, it's not necessarily specific to utilitarianism. He thinks that the answers he gives to these questions would apply to all systems of morality, at least all philosophically reflective systems. Okay, so this chapter is entitled The Sanction, the ultimate sanction. And so we need to next ask here what we mean by a sanction. A sanction, we can understand here as simply something that enforces obedience to a rule. That's what a sanction is, simply something that enforces obedience to a rule. So in this sense, we're familiar with, in the news, we often hear of sanctions being applied to regimes, foreign regimes that the United States or the West doesn't like for some misbehavior they've been perpetrating. That is to say, in order to enforce their obedience to the rule of international law, often sanctions will be imposed. Or often sanctions are referred to in the context of pro sports, where a player will be described as being sanctioned by the league, which means usually they were receiving a fine or suspension. Or oftentimes sanctions are applied to NCAA teams, the big money sport teams that cheat on the rules. So it enforces obedience to a rule. That's what a sanction is. So this is what Mill is concerned with here. And he divides sanctions into the two main categories, what he calls external sanctions and correspondingly internal sanctions. So we have the external and the internal sanctions. The external sanction in the moral sphere refers to, quote, the hope of favor and the fear of displeasure on the part of our fellow humans or God. So this is I'm going to have to sanction my brown pen because it refused to work on me there. But anyway, purple's close enough to brown. So the external sanction is the hope of favor or the fear of displeasure on the part of our fellow humans or God. Basically, the external sanction that causes us to adhere to morality in general is I want people to like me, right? That's the external sanction. I want people to like me. I want people to have me around. I want people to hire me. I want people to, marry me or whatever the case may be. And so I want them to favor me. And of course, I also want to avoid the opposite. I don't want to be a social pariah. I don't want to be an outcast. And so I follow the rules. And the same thing, of course, in relationship to God. I want God's favor. I don't want God to punish. And so that would be an external sanction as he conceives of it. Now, a question arises here specifically in relation to the external sanctions as they are applied to utilitarianism. Namely, on what basis does Mill claim that people would extend favor to those whose acts tend to promote the greatest happiness, and would show disfavor to those whose acts tend to the opposite? On what basis does he think that that will be the case? Why does anyone care whether someone promotes the general happiness or doesn't care about the general happiness or even does things that are contrary to the general happiness? So Mill answers this query in the following way. This is in the third paragraph. He says, men do desire happiness, and however imperfect may be their own practice, they desire and commend all conduct in others towards themselves by which they think their happiness is promoted. In other words, I desire my own happiness, and even if I'm, not such a great person, I don't do all that much to further the happiness of others, I sure am happy when other people further my happiness because I desire my happiness. That's what he's saying, basically. So I see this person out there, I'm walking home from school and I notice something posted on a telephone pole that says, neighborhood litter pickup this weekend. And I think to myself, wow, I approve of this person, this unknown neighbor of mine that I didn't know I had, who's organizing this litter pickup, which is, of course, for the sake of the general happiness, at least within the scope of my neighborhood. I think this is great because this benefits me. This makes me more happy not to have litter all over the place. And so this is, even if I'm not actually planning on helping, I still approve of that person. That's the idea. And similarly, of course, I disapprove of someone when I see someone littering in the neighborhood or, letting their dog poop on the sidewalk or whatever the case may be. I disapprove of that person. And that's all on the basis of my own conception of my own happiness. So in a purely self-interested basis, Mill is saying here, this explains why people would favor someone who promoted the general happiness, because they know that their own happiness is part of that general happiness that's being promoted. What about God? On what basis does Mill claim that God would extend favor to those whose acts tend to promote the general happiness and would show disfavor to those acts who tend towards the opposite? Note here that Mill is not claiming that he believes in God or that belief in God is necessary in order to have moral motivation. Atheists can be moral just as well as religious people. But for those who happen to be motivated to moral behavior by a desire for God's favor or fear of his disapproval, Mill observes that utilitarianism can fit into that desire as much as anything else. He says, this is paragraph 3, towards the bottom of the paragraph, if men believe, as most profess to do, in the goodness of God, those who think that conduciveness to the general happiness is the essence or even the only criterion of good must necessarily believe that it is also that which God approves. Mill presupposes, in other words, that the utilitarian analysis of what goodness entails is valid independently of God. And we'll see this in the next chapter, why he thinks this. So if God is good, then God is a utilitarian in his ethics, because the utilitarian analysis of goodness is the right analysis of goodness. That is, in other words, the utilitarians have got it right in describing what goodness consists in. So if God is good, then God is a utilitarian. And he favors utilitarians, according to the traditional. So it's a kind of interesting hybrid of kind of a traditional understanding of God's providence combined with this utilitarian analysis of morality. However, the external sanctions here are not Mill's real interest in this chapter. His real interest is in the internal sanction. This is the ultimate sanction. Internal sanction in the moral sphere refers to the following. This is in the next paragraph, paragraph 4, beginning in the second half of the second sentence. So what is the internal sanction? You probably already have a clue as to what this is going to be. It's not going to be something outside you that motivates you to morality, but something inside you. And what is this inside or inner thing? It is a pain, more or less intense, attendant upon violation of duty. A pain more or less intense attendant on the violation of duty. So you do something wrong and you feel kind of psychological pain. That's what Mill's referring to. As a result of doing something wrong. Which in properly cultivated moral natures rises, in the more serious cases, into shrinking from it as an impossibility. So even before you commit it, you're contemplating committing an action that's wrong, but it's just like so painful for you to contemplate actually doing that you just can't do it. You shrink back from it. So I just can't do it. I can't do that. This feeling, when disinterested, that is, it's not concerned with your self-interest, but you feel this in relation to some idea of the general good, and connecting with the pure idea of duty and not with some particular form of it, or with any of the merely accessory circumstances, is the essence of conscience. I guess I shouldn't have said connected with the idea of the general good. That sounds too utilitarian. What he's saying here is just if you have a disinterested pain at the contemplation of violating duty just because it's duty, just because you feel like there's an obligation that you have, like keeping your promise or something like that, and you feel so bad at the prospect of not keeping your promise that you just have to do it. And why do you do it? Not because you're worried about your friend not liking you if you don't keep your promise to her, but rather just because you feel like it's your moral obligation to keep a promise. Maybe you don't even like the person, you don't care if they're your friend, but you still feel like I just can't break my word. That's my word, man. I can't break that word. That's what he's talking about as disinterested and connected merely with the idea of duty. Not with some particular form of it, but just with the idea of, I can't break my word. That's my obligation. I've got to do this. Or with any of the merely accessory circumstances is the essence of conscience. So it's not, he's not saying, by referring to these accessory circumstances, I think he's saying here, it's not just that you feel pain because, I don't know, you're going through depression or something like that, and that's causing, some kind of psychological quirk, right? Some specific phase you're going through that makes you averse to breaking your word or something in this particular time. That, you are extraordinarily sensitive at this particular time. No, it's not connected to some particular phase you're going through, but it's a kind of a constant factor in your motivation. Then you're dealing with this thing called the internal sanction, which is the essence of conscience. So there, this is, he describes this as conscience, or conscientious feeling. And it's good to include that there too, because some people might view conscience as sort of a function of pure reason or intellect or something like that. And Mill's pretty clear here that it is a feeling. It's an actual sensation of kind of psychological anguish that goes with the violation of conscience. So that's the internal sanction. The conscientious feelings of mankind. It describes the binding force at the end of the paragraph. He says, its binding force, however, consists in the existence of a mass of feeling which must be broken through in order to do what violates our standard of right, and which, if we nevertheless violate that standard, will probably have to be encountered afterwards in the form of remorse. So if you've got a conscience, you're going to pay for violating your standard of right. It's basically saying either it's going to prevent you from actually doing this act of violation in the first place, or it's going to come back and bite you later on through the pangs of remorse after you've done the dirty deed. Then you're going to feel remorseful, you're going to feel terrible, and so forth. That's where the binding comes from. Essentially, it's like, grabbing a hot piece of metal. It's just aversive therapy. You're just, caused pain by stepping over that line. Like the dog shock collar to keep the dog within the yard, right? That's what conscience is like for Mill. Its binding force consists in the pain that's applied when you step over the boundary of morality. Okay, so the internal sanction of morality is the conscientious feelings of mankind. Can these feelings be cultivated in connection with the utilitarian end of promoting the greatest happiness? And Mill answers that there's no reason to think that they can't. Now, an objection arises in connection with this idea that we could train the conscience to be utilitarian. Some moral philosophers, who Mill calls the transcendental moralists, object that the conscientious feelings cannot be an effective motive if the agent comes to believe that these are just a feeling in her own mind. So in the 6th paragraph of chapter 3, which is rather long, but it's like in the center of the paragraph, he says, the notion, therefore, of the transcendental moralists. So a word here maybe in advance. He calls them transcendental moralists. He's thinking of Immanuel Kant here, I assume. But transcendental in the sense that they believe that conscience is actually something that transcends the senses. Conscience isn't just merely a matter of how you feel about something or the pain that you feel. Its source has to be in something that is above the senses, transcends the senses. So that's where the transcendental comes from. The notion, therefore, of the transcendental moralist must be that this sanction will not exist in the mind unless it is believed to have its root out of the mind. And that if a person is able to say to himself, so quoting the person who's saying this to themselves, that which is restraining me and which is called my conscience is only a feeling in my own mind. He may possibly draw the conclusion that when the feeling ceases, the obligation ceases. And that if he find the feeling inconvenient, he may disregard it and endeavor to get rid himself of it. So the objection here is that if you feel like I have this pangs of conscience, like I want to murder my enemy, but I feel pangs of conscience. So what should I do about this? Well, I say to myself, well, this pangs of conscience, all this represents is just a feeling. You know, maybe I tell myself a story about how I was conditioned by my upbringing to feel qualms about murdering someone, and I just need to get over it, right? So I need to somehow dull that feeling, and this is why often, murders are often committed by people who are intoxicated one way or another. They belt down half a fifth of Jack Daniels or whatever, and then they can go out and kill somebody. It sounds like lyrics to a country song, right? But anyway, this is the objection that's being given rise to here. So if we really want to say that there's a kind of binding force, ultimately, to this idea of conscience, we can't just say, well, it's just a feeling that you have. There's got to be some kind of higher source of this feeling. And of course, we see this in Aquinas, the idea that it's actually the intellect, it's actually our reason, which is our participation in the divine mind, so to speak, that is ultimately responsible for conscience. Conscience is a kind of action of the intellect, a kind of bite of the intellect or reason. Now, Mill's strategy in his reply to this objection is to claim that the problem is not unique to utilitarian or to naturalistic theory. That's really what we're talking about here. So a naturalistic theory, a theory that thinks that ultimately you have to explain moral motivation in terms of, things that psychologists could study or establish as being natural facts about human beings and the way that we're wired, as we say these days. So that's a naturalistic theory. And that's where the problem comes. The person reflects and they say, well, if the only issue is that I'm wired this way, I'll rewire myself so that I can do these evil things that I have a desire to do. And Mill says, well, this isn't a problem just for naturalistic theories because, a person can say the same thing about this transcendent source, whatever it is. Why shouldn't I, ignore it, figure out a way to deny it and so forth? And for centuries, people have observed that this seems to be the classic human attitude towards God. You might have the idea that somehow your conscience is rooted in God, but that doesn't stop people from figuring out ways to ignore it, to bypass the supposed voice of God in you and so forth. So he doesn't think this is a particular problem for utilitarian or even for naturalistic theories. Another possible objection might be that conscientious feelings cannot be developed or developed sufficiently. sufficiently enough to be efficacious, that is, in the case of utilitarianism. Now, Mill, as already stated, holds that there's no reason to think that they can't be, that moral feelings can't be developed or through an educational process that has as its guiding framework utilitarianism. And at the end of the chapter, he provides a more detailed defense of this. He admits that acting in light of a conception of the greatest happiness involves a fairly high degree of intellectual cultivation. Mill places a high degree of confidence in the power of education to cultivate moral feelings in almost any direction, he says. Human beings have proven to be very malleable when it comes to moral indoctrination. In other words, you can indoctrinate your kids to have all different kinds of beliefs about morality, but there are limits. He thinks there are natural limits because there is a human nature for Mill. There is a kind of psychological hardwiring that can't be affected completely. And he says that moral associations that are wholly of artificial creation. I want to say of wholly artificial creation. I think it doesn't make any difference. But the point is, like, if you try to implant something that's really foreign to human nature, like, let's say, arguably Nazism, right? You want to indoctrinate the kids to be little Hitlers. This isn't going to stand the test of time for most of them. Of course, there will be a few little Hitlers out there, but most of them, are just going to go back to the way they were. And Mill also seems to have quite a bit of faith in progress. So this is kind of a general point about human moral progress, that it may be that back in the day, it was common in a lot of places for people to be taught and indoctrinated with things like gender inequality or the acceptability of slavery or of infanticide or these sorts of things. But eventually, as humanity through trial and error and experiment discovers that these things are not really very congenial to human nature, they will gradually fall away, like shedding an old skin, and morals will improve. So what's the upshot of this for whether we could indoctrinate people into utilitarianism? Well, it would follow that if utilitarianism was really fundamentally foreign to human nature, like Nazism arguably is, if that were the case, then it would be an objection to utilitarianism, because it would seem like you couldn't inculcate that as a moral belief. But Mill doesn't think so. What you need in order to be able to have a basis for moral education is, he says, quote, a powerful class of sentiments with which the moral association would harmonize. A powerful class of sentiments with which the moral association would harmonize. So if there's something in human nature, a class of sentiments, of feelings, emotions, that harmonize with utilitarianism, then it's something that we could actually have as a basis of moral education. So in other words, we couldn't simply plant or implant a utilitarian conscience in children through educational indoctrination and expect it to stick unless it harmonized with a natural psychological tendency in human beings. Mill believes that there is such a powerful natural sentiment that harmonizes with the greatest happiness principle. And this is the social sentiments of humankind. So he would say that this conscience is rooted in the social sentiments. Sometimes this is described as human sociability. We are, animals who prefer society, to live in society. Why does Mill believe this? Well, it rests on the proposition that society depends upon consulting the existence of all. He says, this is one of these unfortunate long paragraphs, number 10. So this is the first third of number 10. Yeah, so he says, society between human beings, except in the relation of master and slave, is manifestly impossible on any other footing than that the interests of all are to be consulted. The interests of all are to be consulted. Society between equals can only exist on the understanding that the interests of all are to be regarded equally. And since in all states of civilization, every person, except an absolute monarch, has equals, everyone is obliged to live on these terms with somebody. And in every age, some advance is made toward a state in which it will be impossible to live permanently on other terms with anybody. You see his view there that we're gradually, by baby steps moving towards democracy, which is the ideal state, complete egalitarian state. In this way, people grow up unable to conceive as possible to them a state of total disregard of other people's interests. Society between equals could only exist on the understanding that the interests of all are to be regarded equally. The implication seems to be here that a master-slave relation is not a true society, and it's unsatisfying to human social feelings, although it might presumably be satisfying to other feelings, such as the natural desire to dominate or things like that. But you're not going to have society. You can't truly be friends with your slave, someone that you're enslaving. You may think you are. You may have an illusion of being, but you're not really. Human beings have social feelings that enable them to engage in various forms of cooperation with others, which in turn leads to a natural fusion of one's personal happiness. I have my personal happiness and then the happiness of others, and then these come to be not distinct from each other, that my happiness actually is in part fulfilled in the pursuit of the happiness of others. With proper intellectual cultivation and moral education, this natural identification with the interests of others can be expanded and developed into a utilitarian concern. So you start with the view that, okay, well, I have to consider others in addition to myself. And you can imagine how gradually this could be expanded. So maybe at first you only care about your family or your clan, but then you come to realize, well, I'm also, cooperating with other people in my neighborhood. So you start to feel common cause with people in your neighborhood. Then you go to, of course, your town, or your city, your country, and then pretty soon we have the global village, and you start to feel, that the greatest good of humanity in general is what matters. And so it's a very natural progression of this kind of line of thought. And of course, the more opportunities or necessities we have for cooperating with others, the more naturally this idea of extending my own concern for my self-interest to the interest of others is going to occur. And that's what a utilitarian education would do. It would be involved with things presumably like educating you about the conditions of people in Africa or Asia or somewhere, on the other side of the world, if you're in North America. And as such, you come to, see their interests as a matter of your concern as well. Okay. So that's what I have to say about Chapter 3. So this leads to our first discussion question. Does Mill provide a sufficient explanation of how one can be motivated to live as a utilitarian? Why or why not? First discussion question. Does Mill provide sufficient explanation of how one can be motivated to live as a utilitarian? Why or why not? Now, the second chapter we're going to be considering in this video is Chapter 4, of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. So, Chapter 3 that we just went over explains how one can be motivated to regulate one's conduct by the greatest happiness principle, the principle of utility. We use these interchangeably. The greatest happiness principle, the principle of utility. We'll use both. So, one might ask a young, properly brought up utilitarian, why do you want to promote the general happiness, Mr. or Ms. Young Utilitarian? Why do you want to promote the general happiness? And they would answer, according to Mill, well, because I feel it's the right thing to do. My conscience would trouble me if I didn't, if I wasn't concerned for the general happiness. I wasn't brought up that way to just ignore the general happiness. But if you followed up with this young person and you ask them, well, how do you know you were brought up the right way with the correct information about morality? How do you know that the greatest happiness principle is the correct moral principle? If you ask them that question, they couldn't answer, or at least they couldn't answer in the same way. They couldn't answer on the basis of the considerations in Chapter 3. Even on Mill's own account, all they could say is that they were taught that it was, They were taught the greatest happiness principle, and now they feel that it is worth following, and it really would pain them to ignore it. But they couldn't prove that the greatest happiness principle was the correct moral principle. So this brings us to chapter 4, which is Mill's offering of a quasi-proof. A quasi-proof, that is to say, proof, but like a proof, but not quite a proof. A quasi-proof that his principle is in fact correct. In the general remarks, we saw that Mill admits that the principle of utility, aka the greatest happiness principle, cannot, strictly speaking, be proven to be the correct moral principle. And the reason for this is explained in the opening paragraph of chapter 4, when he says, questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof. So the greatest happiness principle concerns ultimate ends. Ultimate ends. And ultimate ends are not susceptible of proof. We saw that when we looked at the general remarks in the previous video. So what is Mill offering us in place of a proof of the principle of utility? He seems to be taking for granted, first of all, that there is a supreme principle of morality, which is controversial. But at least for the sake of this proof, or chapter, I should say, for the sake of this chapter, he's taking that for granted, for the sake of this quasi-proof. That is, he's not attempting an answer to moral skeptics or moral particularists here. He seems, in general, to consider moral skeptics, there are a variety of these. There could be moral nihilists, people who just deny that anything matters in terms of right and wrong, or moral relativists or subjectivists in various forms of moral anti-realism. So we group these all under moral skepticism. But there could be people who are skeptical about, the idea of impartiality, whether that can actually be a binding force on us and so forth. And then there's also moral particularists who wouldn't deny morality, but they would deny that there's a supreme principle of morality. They would say that no, there's only particular moral judgments. But he's not considering these, he's not worried about these options in this chapter. So he's taking for granted that there is a supreme principle of morality. And that actually plays an important role in his argument. Because the question at issue isn't going to be, is there a supreme principle of morality? And he's not going to take himself to have to be constructing an argument for the existence of such a principle from scratch, from the ground up. Rather, the question at issue is whether the supreme principle of morality is the principle of utility, or whether it's something else. That is, might the utilitarian principle be wrong and some other proposal would be right instead? To rule out this possibility, to rule it out, Mill seeks to show that the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, is the only possible principle of morality. The greatest happiness principle is the only possible principle of morality. And so there is a principle of morality. It's taken for granted as an assumption, it seems, in the context of this chapter. And the only possibility for what it could be is the greatest happiness principle. That's the basic idea. Okay. So in beginning this proof, Mill presupposes, along with the mainstream of the tradition, that all action is for the sake of an end. All action is for the sake of an end. Now, the greatest happiness principle, of course, the principle of utility, states that an action is morally right just in case it promotes the greatest happiness, i.e., pleasure, the most pleasure. So Mill's first step is to show that happiness is the only possible end. Happiness is the only possible end. In fact, his whole argument is going to hinge on this proposition. Ultimately, that's the reason that the only possible answer to the question, what is the supreme principle of morality, is the principle of utility. It's because happiness is the only possible end for Mill. So he seems to presuppose something like the following argument. In the second and third paragraphs, I won't read this, but I will just reconstruct this argument, which represents mostly considerations in the second and third paragraph, but also throughout the chapter. So, premise 1. For anything to be an end, it must be desired. Premise 1. For anything to be an end, it must be desired. Premise 2. Pleasure is the only thing that can be desired. Premise 2. Pleasure is the only thing that can be desired. Premise 3. Thus, pleasure is the only possible end. Premise 3. Thus, pleasure is the only possible end. Premise 4. If pleasure is the only possible end, then the ultimate end for an individual could only be the greatest pleasure for that individual, or, equivalently, individual happiness. That is to say that the greatest pleasure for the individual and individual happiness is two different terms for the same thing. Okay, so premise 4, if pleasure is the only possible end, then the ultimate end for an individual could only be the greatest pleasure for that individual, or individual happiness. Premise 5. The ultimate moral end is the aggregate of all individual ends. Premise 5. The ultimate moral end is the aggregate of all individual ends. Conclusion. Thus, the ultimate moral end is the aggregate of individual happinesses, or maybe we should say the aggregate of individual happiness. But what we're imagining here is you have your happiness, I have my happiness, my neighbor has her happiness. It's all the happinesses are put together, and the aggregate is the ultimate moral end. And this is what he calls the general happiness. So the conclusion is that the ultimate moral end is the aggregate of individual happinesses, or in other words, the general happiness. So the ultimate moral end is the general happiness, but this is simply an alternative way of putting the greatest happiness principle. To say that actions are right as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to promote the opposite of happiness is to say that is equivalent, logically equivalent, Mill seems to think, to saying that the ultimate moral end is the general happiness. So we'll go over this argument one more time quickly. So premise, beginning from the start, I'll just read it out here without numbering the premises. So for anything to be an end, it must be desired. Pleasure is the only thing that can be desired. Thus, pleasure is the only possible end. If pleasure is the only possible end, then the ultimate end for an individual could only be the greatest pleasure for that individual. That is, individual happiness. The ultimate moral end is the aggregate of all individual ends. Thus, the ultimate moral end is the aggregate of individual happiness, or in other words, the general happiness. Now, there are problems here with, let's say, equating the greatest happiness for all with the aggregate of individual happinesses. I mean, questions can arise about that because, of course, there may be considerations about balancing individual happinesses and sacrifices needing to be made some places. And so it's not clear that there's this equivalency between the aggregate of individual happinesses and the general happiness. But anyway, we're leaving that to one side for now. We'll come back to it next time. Leaving that aside, the controversial premise in this argument is premise 2. Why think that pleasure is the only thing that can be desired? Why is pleasure the only thing that can be desired? Now, Mill's answer to this is given in paragraphs 9 and 10, and it's a bit confusing. So I will quote a good chunk of this. So this begins in the, second half of the second sentence of paragraph 9 and continue through the end of paragraph 10. If human nature is so constituted as to desire nothing which is not either a part of happiness or a means of happiness, we can have no other proof, and we require no other, that these are the only things desirable. If so, happiness is the sole end of human action, and the promotion of it the test by which to judge of all human conduct, from whence it necessarily follows that it must be the criterion of morality, since a part is included in the whole. And now to decide whether this is really so, whether mankind do desire nothing for itself, but that which is a pleasure to them, or of which the absence is a pain, we have evidently arrived at a question of fact and experience, dependent, like all similar questions, upon evidence. It can only be determined by practiced self-consciousness and self-observation, assisted by observation of others. I believe that these sources of evidence, impartially consulted, will declare that desiring a thing and finding it pleasant, aversion to it and thinking of it as painful, are phenomena entirely inseparable, or rather two parts of the same phenomenon. In strictness of language, two different modes of naming the same psychological fact. That to think of an object as desirable and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing. And that to desire anything except in proportion as the idea is pleasant is a physical and metaphysical impossibility. So this is somewhat difficult stuff to parse. And what's confusing about this answer, among other things, is that on the one hand, he states that whether pleasure is the only thing we can desire is a question of fact and experience, which suggests that it's a testable empirical question. Is pleasure the only thing we can desire? Well, let's go experiment and observe and figure it out, right? So he recommends we test this by introspecting primarily and then by observing others, presumably their behavior, and seeing whether it matches what we associate with our introspection and seeing what human nature is like and this sort of thing. So there's this kind of empirical idea that we base this claim that pleasure is the only thing we can desire by empirical evidence. And we did a controlled study and we discovered that human beings only can desire pleasure. So there's that. But then there's also the claim in this same passage that seems to be a denial of this. That he says that it's not only a physical but also a metaphysical impossibility, which suggests that there's some kind of intrinsic ontological or essential identity between pleasure and desire. Of course, that depends on what you mean by metaphysical, but leaving that to one side. So he suggests that their identity is metaphysically necessary, that maybe it's even a conceptual truth that we can only desire pleasure. And some of his language suggests that. And it suggests that their identity is metaphysically necessary, and it's unclear how we can establish such a strong sense of necessity merely from experience and introspection. And so this language, when he talks about to think of an object as desirable and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing, is he making here a psychological point? He sounds like he's making something more like a conceptual point, like to think of something as a circle and to think of it as having a diameter or being a bounded figure, maybe that's a better example, are one and the same thing. It almost suggests that there's a conceptual necessity there. And see, so are we to interpret this psychologically? That would go with the idea that this is empirically established, this identity of desire and pleasure. Or are we to think of it as a conceptual connection? Well, if he means there is a conceptual connection, then it might be something like this, that he's holding that a desire is simply, essentially or ontologically, a representation of an object as pleasurable. So if you say, define what a desire is, if you give the concept of desire, it is to represent an object or a representation of an object as pleasurable. To desire X is to represent X as pleasure. To desire candy bar is to represent that candy bar as a source of pleasure, or the act of eating it as a pleasure. Conversely, to think of an object as pleasant, to think of it as pleasant, candy bar. To do that, to have that thought, just is to think of it as desirable. So you can't do anything else. So it seems like a kind of conceptual truth, but it also has a kind of psychological character to it. That you're psychologically prevented from, Mill would tend to think in these terms. You're psychologically prevented. That's why you're conceptually prevented from thinking of it in any other way. Notice that this way of thinking of it construes pleasure as an attitude towards sensations rather than sensation itself. So I'm eating the candy bar, I'm experiencing various sensations in my taste buds, but those same sensations in my taste buds might be thought undesirable by someone else. So, if I describe these sensations, one sensation of sweetness and vanilla, caramel, chocolate, and there's someone over here who's experiencing the same thing. They know, they could distinguish the various elements of the candy bar, but they hate it. They have a negative attitude towards it because they don't like the taste of chocolate. They don't like sweet things. So that's the way Mill's construing pleasure, something more like an attitude towards a sensation rather than a sensation itself. Mill's view seems to be that all the data of introspection somehow reveals to us this truth. Desirability and pleasure are one and the same mental phenomenon, simply described from different angles. In the case of desirability, we describe the phenomenon sort of from the subjective side, and in the case of pleasure, we describe it more from the objective side. So for Mill, it's metaphysically impossible to desire something besides pleasure. If you desire it, you're thinking of it as pleasurable, as a pleasure. The thing you desire, of course, may be something that most people wouldn't regard as pleasurable. Maybe it's some religious ascetic practice or extreme endurance test or even death. But it's still pleasurable for the person who desires it. And it may be pleasurable, it's an attitude that's incomprehensible to the rest of us maybe, but nonetheless, it's still pleasurable if this analysis is correct. So Mill also defends his view that happiness is the only end of conduct by defending it against objections. And first he defends it against the possible objection that people also seek other things besides happiness, and in particular that they seek virtue and the absence of vice as ultimate ends, even if this should mean sacrificing happiness. So what about that possibility? That happiness isn't the only thing that is desired or desirable, because virtue is too. Well, Mill explains that actually there's no real opposition or incompatibility here, because virtue can be a part of happiness. The end of paragraph 5, he says, the ingredients of happiness are very various, and each of them is desirable in itself, and not merely when considered as swelling in aggregate. The principle of utility does not mean that any given pleasure, as music for instance, or any given exemption from pain, as for example health, is to be looked upon as a means to a collective something termed happiness, and to be desired on that account. They are desired and desirable in and for themselves, besides being means. They are not a part of the end. Virtue, according to the utilitarian doctrine, is not naturally and originally part of the end, but is capable of becoming so. And in those who live it disinterestedly, it has become so, and is desired and cherished not as a means to happiness, but as part of their happiness. So what he's suggesting here is that virtue originally is not something that's desirable as an ultimate end, but virtue is originally something that's desirable only as a means to happiness, conceived as something that's instrumentally valuable for the achievement of some primitive pleasures. For example, think of like young men who cultivate virtue so that they can win the hand of a fair lady. In other words, virtue is merely a means to get sex. That's the primitive pleasures, one of the examples of this. But over time, he says, it developed into an end in itself. And to illustrate this idea, he compares it to other things. He notes that there are other things besides virtue that are like this, that start out merely as means to an end, but then eventually become things that are desired as ends in themselves, such as the desire for money, power, fame. And at the end of this, towards the end of paragraph 6, he says, in these cases, so he's thinking about virtue, money, power, fame, these things. He says, in these cases, the means have become a part of the end. That is, what was originally a means to happiness, like seeking money for the sake of being able to purchase things to satisfy your desires becomes an end in itself, and people come to desire money just for the sake of accumulating money. It becomes a part of their happiness, a constituent, a part of the end. Because happiness, he's saying, is a complex end. It's going to include the satisfaction of a bunch of different desires and pleasures. And why couldn't it be possible for someone to have as one of their main pleasures the accumulation of wealth? Right? Nothing wrong with that. And he's saying virtue is just like that. It's something that was originally merely a means to happiness, but then it becomes a part of your happiness, becomes one of the constituent elements of your happiness. In these cases, the means have become a part of the end, and are more a part of it than any of the things which they are means to. What was once desired as an instrument for the attainment of happiness has come to be desired for its own sake. And being desired for its own sake, it is, however, desired as a part of happiness. So effectively, the objection originally was, well, you've got happiness over here. That's one ultimate end, but it's not the only one, because you also have something competing with it, namely virtue. And what Mill is essentially saying is, no, as a matter of fact, virtue is just absorbed in happiness. It becomes, for some people, a part of their happiness to perform virtuous actions for their own sake, for its own sake. It's not something separate from happiness. A final objection would be to try to separate the will from desire. Some philosophers might concede to Mill that desire is metaphysically bound up with pleasure as its object, but deny that this has direct implications for morality. They would say that morality concerns not what one desires, but rather what one wills. And the will, they would say, is a separate faculty from desire. They would further argue then that, this is quoting from Mill, a person of confirmed virtue or any other person whose purposes are fixed carries out his purposes without any thought of pleasure. Right? So, to hell with my desires for pleasure. My will is going to overcome that. I'm going to pursue this purpose. And of course, this might be virtuous activity, but it could just be, some megalomaniacal purpose that I have that my will is fixed on. So against this, Mill rejects the notion that there's some faculty of will that's set over against desire, just as he did with the supposed opposition between happiness and virtue as ultimate ends, in making virtue really just a part of happiness. So too, he makes the will becomes just a part of the will. The will becomes just a part of desire. The will is simply habitual desire. So he describes this in second to the last paragraph, law in paragraph 11. Will, the active phenomenon, is a different thing from desire, the state of passive sensibility. And although originally an offshoot of it, may in time take root and detach itself from the parent stock. So much so that in the case of habitual purpose, instead of willing the thing because we desire it, we often desire it only because we will it. So he's saying that if you desire something kind of habitually, this can become a kind of a settled desire. And this is what will is. And oftentimes this isn't felt as being an active sensation of desire anymore or something like that. In the middle of the paragraph, the distinction between will and desire thus understood is an authentic and highly important psychological fact. But the fact consists solely in this. So this is what the distinction between will and desire consists in. That will, like all other parts of our constitution, is amenable to habit. And that we may will from habit when we no longer desire for itself, or desire only because we will it. It is not the less true that will in the beginning is entirely produced by desire, including in that term the repelling influence of pain as well as the attractive one of pleasure. Will is the child of desire, he goes on to say, and passes out of dominion of its parent only to come under that of habit. So when our desires become habitual, this is what we call will. And sometimes this force of habit appears as if it can fight and conquer desires. But this is merely a matter of old, ingrained, and encrusted desires being stronger than newer, less established desires. That's the point. So there's not really this distinction between will and desire. Desire remains supreme and is the only thing that explains our activity and our pursuit of ends. And desire, of course, is intrinsically connected to pleasure, which is why the greatest happiness principle is the only really possible principle of morality, and thus we have our quasi-proof. Okay, this leads to the second discussion question. Does Mill succeed in providing an adequate proof, or quasi-proof, of the correctness of the principle of utility? Is he right that pleasure is the only thing that can be desired? Why or why not? Once again, second discussion question. Does Mill succeed in providing an adequate proof or quasi-proof of the correctness of the principle of utility? Is he right that pleasure is the only thing that can be desired? Why or why not?